After Brian died, we collapsed. Paul took over and supposedly led us, you know. But what is leading us when we went round in circles? We broke up then.
It's a story that every single Beatles fan has heard. The day that changed everything. When their band manager, mentor, and friend, Brian Epstein, tragically and suddenly lost his life. The man who had shaped the Beatles, brought them forward into the light, dedicated himself almost completely to their success. Losing Brian, that's what did the Beatles in. Without his steady hand, the Beatles were left to their own devices, a situation they were wholly unprepared for. And yes, all of this is true, but it isn't the whole truth. Without being cruel, let's start with this. To those close to Brian, his death and the cause of it were not a surprise. And another sad truth, had Brian not died, had he continued to be there for the band, it would only be a matter of time before they had turned on him, before they had realized what he had done to them, how he had kept them in the dark, misled them, failed to mention the clauses he had inserted into contracts that the Beatles admittedly did not read. One way or another, Brian's time with the Beatles was drawing to a close. It is just horrific that it happened the way it did. All we can do now is talk about the aftermath. This is part 3 of a series dedicated to one question. Why did the Beatles break up? While you can begin here, I highly suggest you begin with part 1, which will provide an enormous amount of context and help you to begin to understand how these incredible friends, musicians, and cultural icons fell apart so contentiously.
The feeling that anybody has when somebody close to them dies, there's a sort of little hysterical sort of he and that it's not me or something in it. And the other feeling is, gee, you know, what the fuck, you know? What can I do, you know? I mean, I knew that we were in trouble then.
1967 had been an insane year for the Beatles. Psychedelia had come into full bloom. LSD was everywhere. There was something new in the air, some fluid, free-flowing trust. To put it stereotypically, love and peace. The Beatles, after having quit touring, immediately took advantage of their newly acquired time, sinking more hours than ever into the studio and producing Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, widely considered amongst the best albums of all time. It was a huge success, and the Beatles' cultural impact only continued to grow. But acid isn't a magic key that unlocks some great inner wisdom that allows you to see the world for what it really is. Sure, it can make you feel that way, and it can bring about inner change, but the truth is that it is simply a matter of altering your brain chemistry. And if you begin to alter it on a frequent basis, you start to get some weird thoughts. Ideas like creating a Beatles commune, buying an island, specifically one in Greece, which had just undergone a transformation into a military dictatorship. What does this matter though? As John himself would put it, I'm not worried about the political situation in Greece, as long as it doesn't affect us. Eventually, the high does wear off, and you move on to the next thing. Just a month later, the Beatles attend a lecture by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. 2 days after that, they declare that drugs aren't the answer after all, and that they're going straight. Meditation is all they need. We'll see how long that lasts. Speaking of altered brain chemistry, how about a daytime diet of amphetamines before a nighttime snack of barbiturates, downers, and various sleeping pills? This was Brian Epstein's habit at this time, one he had made efforts to throw, seeing psychologists, and more than once checking himself into the Priory Hospital. Brian had always suffered immensely with his mental health. This wasn't new to him, but it was exacerbated by his current circumstances. With the Beatles quitting touring, he now found himself lacking purpose. Along with this, he was putting into motion the selling of his company, Nims Enterprises, without the Beatles' knowledge. And the end of his management contract with the band was drawing near at a period where he had never felt further away from the band. It is now time for a trigger warning. We will spend the next chapter discussing Brian's drug abuse his death, as well as an attempt on his life. This content is very upsetting, so please skip ahead if you need to. Brian's use of pills had been ongoing for years. He became introduced to them through the Beatles, who themselves were using them. Initially, it was just amphetamines, but as his abuse grew, so did the side effects. He would stay up for days, becoming manic, paranoid. He, like so many others, found a remedy. End the day by snuffing out the uppers with some downers. Enter a near coma, wake up at 3 p.m. the next day, and repeat. Those who worked close to Brian were constantly on edge. As a result of the drugs, he was liable to fly into fits of disproportionate rage. For his secretary and assistants, it became very difficult to even organize business appointments for Brian, who beyond sleeping well into the afternoon, would sometimes refuse to leave his room at all or cancel at the last minute. This is not to say that Brian was not a hard worker. He was, and always had been, and when he was functioning, he was as fastidious as anyone. But as his mental health declined, he became overwhelmed. It was this fact that led him to initiate the sale of his company to a man named Robert Stigwood. Brian had overdosed before. Multiple times, in fact. And while most were thought to be accidental, it is likely that at least one was a suicide attempt. There are certain things you are not going to find well documented, and for good reason. They are personal and extremely upsetting. You aren't going to hear this in the anthology series or any official documentary. Peter Brown recalled an incident that occurred in late September of 1966. I was sort of staying at Chapel Street most of the time. I don't know if I had been watching television or what, but I was in the house. Before going to bed, I suddenly realized that Brian had been missing for part of the evening, and I found him in a very heavy state of unconsciousness and called his doctor. He took an overdose on purpose. We know that because we found a note. I called his driver and we carried him to the car because I was very nervous of calling the ambulance or police since it would have been a scandal. And that driver, Brian Barrett, would recall. I got the call from Peter Brown. He couldn't handle it because of the weight of the man. It was late at night and we broke the door down and rolled Brian up in a blanket. I threw him over my shoulder and got him into the car, and we rushed up to Putney Heath. They pumped him out, and he was moaning and crying on the table. I was watching them pump him out, and he became conscious after a while. He was muttering and mumbling, and you could hear what he was saying, but I don't want to go into that one. But Brian's death, by almost all accounts, appears to have been accidental. He had planned to meet the Beatles at the Maharishi's clinic in Bangor, following the August 25th bank holiday weekend. He had a get-together planned at Kingsley Hill, his Sussex home, inviting Peter Brown along with Jeffrey Ellis. The following recollections are shared by them. Jeffrey Ellis and I drove down together, but it wasn't soon enough for Brian. He'd already been down there for a day and was already bored. We had invited people down later who subsequently didn't turn up. Brian, in his agitated state, was suddenly confronted with the fact that there was this long holiday weekend yawning ahead, with no apparent entertainment arriving. All he was stuck with was two of his oldest friends, which was not very exciting. Brian suddenly decided that he would go up to London. Peter Brown and I tried to dissuade him because he'd had a fair amount to drink, and we felt that he ought to keep his own plan of spending a quiet week in the country. But he was determined, and so we drove off in his car. He called late in the afternoon and was speaking in a woozy voice. He apologized for not coming back and maybe letting us worry. I suspect that when he went back to London, he did go out, cruised the West End for a bit, and then went home. I urged him to come back to the country, but there was no way he could drive back because he sounded pretty awful, and I suggested him coming on the train. It was an unlikely thing for him to do, but it was the only thing I could think of at the time. Now let's hear from assistant Joanne Peterson. On Sunday lunchtime, I got a call from the couple that lived in the house, Antonio and Maria. Antonio said that he was very concerned that Brian had come back from Kingsley Hill on Friday. His car hadn't moved since Saturday, and it was now Sunday lunchtime. I asked him why he was concerned, because it wasn't unusual for Brian to go into his room and stay there, take some pills, go to sleep, and check out for 24 hours. I told him not to worry, that I was sure everything was all right. But I said to my mother, you know, I just think I might drive over to Chapel Street and make sure that all is okay. I got to Chapel Street, let myself in, found Antonio, and went up to Brian's door. I knocked on the door and I called out his name. And then I went up to my room and I tried the intercom, and there was no reply. So then I went down to the kitchen and I called down to Kingsley Hill and spoke to Peter Brown. I asked, why did Brian come back? Why is he here? He gave me some reason that Brian was bored and came back into town. I said, well, I'm very concerned. Brian's in his room. He hasn't been out of it since Saturday. I'm going to have to break the doors down. Peter suggested she call Brian's doctor, John Galway. Antonio and John Galway broke the doors down. Antonio and John went in and I followed them. The curtains were drawn and John was directly ahead of me. I could just see part of Brian in the bed and I was totally stunned. I knew that something really bad had happened. Then I think John told me, just wait outside. A few minutes later, John came out. I'd never seen a doctor so white. We were all white, and we knew that Brian had died. Obviously, with his history of mental health issues, there has been much speculation that his overdose was intentional. Just about everyone in his life disagrees with this. His assistant, Alistair Taylor, would say,
I'd like to explain why I am so sure. One big reason was that only days before, he'd had Queenie, his mother, staying with him, because his father, Harry, had died 6 weeks earlier, and Brian adored his mother and father. And the last thing that guy would have done to his mother was to commit at that time. Brian was just lying in bed. I was right behind the doctor. I heard the door smash down, and I went running up the stairs right behind the doctor. And I thought Brian was just asleep. And on his bed was lying a plate of chocolate digestive biscuits, and down by the side of his bed was a half-full bottle of bitter lemon drink. No alcohol to be seen. But more importantly, on the bedside table, there were about 6 or 7 pill bottles, right? All prescribed by his doctor, because Brian did need pills to wake him up, pills to put him to sleep, pills to calm him down. Now, they're all half full, and the lids were screwed back on. Now, if you're going to commit suicide by taking an overdose, you don't half do it and put the lid back on the bottle that you've taken the tablets out of. You know, it just doesn't add up. There was no note. I've heard so many times, and I'm sick of it, how a note was found and was hidden and destroyed. There were 2 people in that room, the doctor and me, nobody else. And there was no note, and Brian had just died. He'd taken 1 pill too many, and the coroner's verdict was that it was an accidental overdose. And Brian had 1 particular tablet. I can't tell you what it was for, I don't know. But it had 2 ingredients in it. And it transpires that 1 passed through his system perfectly normally, but 1 was building up in his stomach. So in other words, it would have happened sooner or later, but he'd taken, I think it was 3 instead of 1, and it was just enough to tip the balance over. But he didn't take 3 to commit. He took it because he thought it won't hurt. And in fact, that was the coroner's verdict, and that is one that I know. One of the saddest days of my life.
Can you tell me, do you take it seriously, this cult?
Cult? I wouldn't call it a cult, and of course we take it seriously. We wouldn't be sitting here, would we? You know, it's
only you that isn't taking it seriously. Everybody else here is.
When you are the Beatles, there is no escaping the media. And here, at the Maharishi's camp, they were even more vulnerable. Just moments after the news, they were surrounded by the press and made to make statements. You can read the absolute shock and horror on John's face especially. And behind the scenes, things were arguably worse. The Maharishi took full advantage of what he saw as an opportunity. The following is recounted by Marianne Faithfull. It was agony to be with the Beatles with nobody else there. This was very unusual. Normally the Beatles had thousands of minders, but then it was simply John and Cynthia, Paul and Jane, Patty and George, Ringo, and me and Mick. that was it. The minute the news came through that Brian had died, it was shameful the way the Maharishi exploited it. The Beatles were shattered. I can hardly bear to remember it. I think he actually said, "Brian Epstein is dead. He was taking care of you. He was protecting you. He was like your father. I will be your father now." It was the most terrible thing. More than any other Beatle, it seems that George truly took the Maharishi's words to heart. This is no indictment on George, whose heart I believe was in the right place, but in the wake of Brian's death, George immediately fell back on the words that the Maharishi was speaking to them.
There's such thing as death anyway. I mean, it's death on a physical level, but life goes on everywhere, and you just keep going, really. But so the thing is, it's not as disappointing as it is and it isn't, you know. And the thing about the comfort is to know that it's okay.
And John, searching for some understanding, some pillar to fall back on, eventually did too. Let's hear more from Marianne. Brian would have had no problem talking to the Beatles about the Maharishi. Here's what would have happened if he hadn't taken the overdose. They would come back to London, and Brian would have said, "How was it?" And they would have all cracked up laughing, as if it was the most ridiculous thing. The trouble with him dying at that moment was that it actually pushed them into the arms of the Maharishi, whereas if he hadn't died, it would have blown over. The Maharishi was the most ludicrous little man you could imagine. Everybody realized this, and we were all embarrassed. With that, it is time to talk about that very man, Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. Keep in mind as we talk here, that any critiques voiced are directed firmly at the Maharishi himself, and not at Hindu faith or transcendental meditation as a practice, both of which have proved enormously beneficial to an untold number of individuals. But as with any faith or practice, there are individuals who will take advantage of the power that wielding these tools grants you. The disdain some held for the Maharishi had nothing to do with what he taught, but the manner in which he taught, and in which he grew his following. The Maharishi had found his success in the westernization of ancient Vedic knowledge. He simplified and distilled core elements in a manner that could be easily communicated, easily marketed, and spread throughout the world. This alone was enough to upset more traditional Hindus who felt he was watering down their faith, and in essence, he was. The proliferation and extreme popularity of transcendental meditation today would not exist without the Maharishi. There is no discrediting his marketing genius and his ability to communicate and teach these practices to a variety of pupils from all sorts of backgrounds. He took something that was firmly rooted in Hinduism, and while still keeping the roots intact, grew it into something that could be appreciated by those of any or no faith. Transcendental meditation was not taught as a way to become closer to some higher power, but as a way to become closer to oneself, to find inner bliss from within. And the Maharishi had introduced one ingredient to the pot that no other respectable guru had before: money. Traditionally, meditation was to be taught for free at an ashram. To charge money for something of this manner would be blasphemous, distortive. But Maharishi's justification was this: how am I supposed to spread this wonderful thing, to teach it throughout the world, if I do not have the means to do so? So this is what he did. Maharishi asked for a one-off payment of 1 week's earnings from his students, and with this, he was able to present a fair, pay only what you are able projection, while also accumulating capital to further spread his practices. John would defend this, saying that it was the fairest thing I've ever heard of. So what if he's commercial? We're the most commercial group in the world. The Maharishi recognized immediately the marketing potential he had with the band, the most popular band in the world. He would tell them repeatedly, "You have created a magic air through your names. You have got to use that magic influence. Yours is a tremendous responsibility."
Magical Mystery Tour was another way he'd set it up, and then he came and showed me what his idea was, and this is how it went. It went around like this, the story, and he had it all, I think, production, and he says, "Well, here's the segment, you write a little piece for that."
What could be more demonstrative of the Beatles' madness, their messiness following Brian's death, than the magical mystery tour? Well, first off, that statement is a bit misleading. Magical Mystery Tour, in its full conception as a Beatle-written and filmed piece of work, existed long before Brian's death, and Brian himself even helped to plan the whole thing with Paul, whose idea it was. So to say that if Brian had not died, then this fiasco would not have occurred entirely is inaccurate. In the days immediately after Brian's death, no one had a clue what to do. Not the Beatles, not their team. It was a moment of horror. But if there is anyone who cannot bear not knowing what to do, it is Paul McCartney. It is here that the dynamics of the band would change forever. With Sgt. Pepper, Paul had led the Beatles musically as a bandmate, and now, with Brian gone, he felt the need to spearhead the Beatles, not just as a musical act, but as an entity, as a movement. For Paul, this was not a moment to indulge in the shell shock. His message to the rest of the Beatles was this: we must keep going. We are on top of the world, and that is where I intend to stay. The following is recounted by the Beatles' publicist, Tony Barrow. In the midst of this surreal scenario, Paul came forward with his own very feasible solution to John's indecision. He proposed that the Beatles should embark immediately upon the making of Magical Mystery Tour. My colleagues condemned him for acting callously, but Paul explained his motives to me very convincingly. If most of the Beatles clear off to India now, I doubt if we'll ever come together again as a working band. He felt that throwing themselves into filming would keep the four guys together until they could plan their long-term future with clearer minds. I didn't get the impression that Paul was any less affected by Brian's death than the others were. It just seemed to be the way he coped with loss, accepting what had happened and trying to be practical about it. Looking back on it all those years later, it's obvious that Paul saw a vacancy in leadership after Brian died, and he stepped in. Perhaps that ultimately led to the band's breakup, but the fact of the matter is that someone had to. As I see it, Paul saved the band. In stark contrast to Tony's recollection, any statement from George, and especially John, regarding this transitional period is bitter, very bitter.
I think Paul had an impression, he has it now like a parent, that we should be thankful for what he did. But he kept for keeping the Beatles going, but when you look upon it objectively, he kept it going for his own sake, you know.
I am not here to speak up in defense of Paul or any other Beatle, but I would like to note that last bit from John there. In the wake of Brian's death, it was not as if there was some coordinated effort from the Beatles to figure out what to do next. Paul was not elected head Beatle. At this specific point in time, John, George, and Ringo, they didn't know what to do. They certainly did not want to decide what to do. In some ways, they were perfectly content for Paul to take up that position, that responsibility. I'm not going to pretend they were happy with the arrangement, but from what I've read, the general consensus was, better him than me. The production of Magical Mystery Tour was a disaster. Portions of it were good fun, especially the initial road trip segment, where they conducted a real, quote-unquote, magical mystery tour with their cast of characters. But without any real organization or experienced leadership, logistical problems constantly arose, such as finding themselves short on lunches and accommodations for their cast. In between filming, they continued to record music. On September 25th, they would begin recording The Fool on the Hill, and present for this session, for the very first time, was Yoko Ono. Since their introduction in late 1966, John and Yoko had maintained a platonic but consistent correspondence. John, more and more, grew to admire her work and helped to finance a show of hers. They would send each other letters, and slowly but surely, these letters grew more and more intimate. Not yet in a sexual sense, but emotionally. They no longer resembled letters between friends or peers. And at this point, Cynthia was none the wiser. I think it would be fair to say that John absolutely had an attraction for Yoko by this point. While it was primarily creative and intellectual, John did explore consummating it physically, if only out of habit or curiosity. Yoko would recall the following. John had invited me to the recording studio. He suddenly said, "You look tired. Would you like to rest?" I thought he was taking me to another room, but instead he went off to this flat. I think it belonged to Neil. When we got there, Neil started to fold the sofa down into a bed. Maybe John thought we were two adults. We didn't have to pretend, but it was so sudden, so crude. I just rejected it. Additional scenes for Magical Mystery Tour were filmed throughout October, and by the time it was finished, it became immediately clear that it was a horrible mess. Peter Brown recalls, when Magical Mystery Tour was finally finished, Paul screened it for everyone at NIMS. The reaction was unanimous. It was awful. It was formless, disconnected, disjointed, and amateurish. I told Paul to junk it. So what? We lost 40,000 pounds, I said. Better to junk it than to be embarrassed by it. But Paul's ego wouldn't let him consider this. He was positive that Magical Mystery Tour would be as warmly greeted by the public as all the Beatles products that came before it. Reluctantly, we sold the TV rights to the BBC, who put it on the air on December 26th, Boxing Day in England, when millions of Britons were at home celebrating the holidays. Critically, the movie was a failure. Publicly, an embarrassment, to such an extent that Paul basically went on a press tour to apologize and explain that they did their best. Commercially, however, the film made a boatload of money. As Peter Brown would put it, as usual, whatever they touched turned to money. But money was about to become their biggest problem.
What is Apple, John?
It's a company we're setting up which involves records, films, electronics, which make records and films work.
When Brian was alive, if the Beatles ever had to pay a bill, all they had to do was make a phone call, and it was taken care of. Money was no tangible object to the Beatles. Sure, they always wanted more of it, but they seemingly always had as much as they needed. But after Brian's death, they were suddenly confronted with the cold truth. Their finances were a disaster. They were being taxed 95% on a significant chunk of their earnings. The reality they thought they lived in, of always having enough money, was an illusion. Every single one of them was living beyond their means. The Beatles, as a business, were enormous. The amount of money they brought in was mind-boggling. But up until this point, the Beatles and their team had not done what was really the most simple solution. Expand, accumulate capital, and then go public. If you don't want all your earnings above a certain amount, taxed at 95%, then this is what you need to do. And this was exactly what the tax experts communicated to the Beatles. But the Beatles only heard one thing: spend money. Let's face it, the Beatles lived in a fantasy world. They had no idea as to what the day-to-day operations of a legitimate business looked like. And really, why would they? All they had done since they turned 15 was play music. They had made it where they were today thanks to Brian, who himself got in way over his head. The Beatles still had their team, of course, but the fact of the matter was that their team was primarily composed of yes-men, who, even if they disagreed with some insane idea of the band's, would usually go along with it. Anyways, it had worked out to this point, hadn't it? There were initially conversations of the Beatles opening up a chain of record stores, if only to invest in the real estate, but that was far too normal, too practical for the boys. They were dreamers. Thus, Apple Corps was born. This all took place before Brian's death, though was still only in the planning stages. But once Brian passed, all the plans they had laid were rearranged. Initially, Brian's company NIMS was to be tied into Apple. But once the Beatles realized that Robert Stigwood now basically controlled the company, they refused to have anything to do with him. So occurred the following. Robert Stigwood was forced out. Between the combined efforts of the Beatles, Brian's brother, Clive Epstein, and Lord Goodman, perhaps the country's most eminent lawyer, they reached an agreement with Stigwood. But Stigwood undoubtedly got the last laugh. As a result of this arrangement, he departed with the equivalent of nearly £8 million today, plus half of the NIMS artist roster, among them Cream, the Bee Gees, and Jimi Hendrix. Suffice to say, he did just fine for himself. But despite NIMS now being controlled by Clive Epstein, he was not interested at all in merging with the Beatles' new business venture, Apple. Ringo would later say, "We tried to form Apple with Clive Epstein, but he wouldn't have it. He didn't believe in us, I suppose. He didn't think we could do it. He thought we were 4 wild men, and we were going to spend all his money and make him broke." Without the structure NIMS would have provided, just about everyone in the Beatles circle up until that point now found themselves promoted, given a role in the new company. Roadie assistant Neil Aspinall now suddenly found himself manager. Derek Taylor was brought on officially as press officer. The Beatles' ambitions had never let them down to this point. The business very quickly pivoted from a tax break to an idealistic, utopian dream. Peter Brown recalls, "Apple had to reflect the spirit of the times we were living in. It had to be something bigger, more encompassing than just becoming shopkeepers." Overnight, the idea mushroomed, as was the Beatles' wont, and Apple became bigger than life, just like them. Right away, the Beatles began distributing money to the worst people imaginable.
I'll tell you about this chap, who's called Alex. And he's great, he's a Greek fella. And he's invented incredible things, you see. So, that'll be big.
Let's start with Magic Alex. He was appointed head of Apple Electronics.
Hello, I'm Alexis from Apple Electronics. I would like to say hello to all my brothers around the world, and to all the girls around the world, and to all the electronic people around the world. That is Apple Electronics.
It turns out that Alex's fantastical ideas were just that, fantasy. He failed to produce even a single practical, reproducible design. He was also thrown unimaginable amounts of money to create a futuristic studio for the Beatles. Then there was the Apple Boutique, envisioned as a beautiful place where you could buy beautiful things. Spearheading this boutique would be the design collective The Fool, one of the leading figures in the psychedelic aesthetic, who made art and designed clothing. They were given the equivalent of about £1.6 million to design, open, and stock the shop with their merchandise. What the Beatles failed to take note of was the fact that the last boutique The Fool opened quickly went bankrupt, in large part due to their exorbitant personal expenses. Appointed to actually manage this boutique were Patty's sister, Ginny Boyd, and John's friend Pete Shotton. Shotton would recall the following: "I tried to pin John down as to what my role in Apple might consist of. Well, he said, we're planning to open a clothing shop for starters. Eventually we'll have a chain of Apple boutiques all over the world. But the first one's gotta be in London. Since you know all about shops, why don't you just run that?" "But I don't know anything at all about boutiques, John." "Well, just have a go at it, Pete. If you don't like it, then fuck it. We'll find you something else to do." Sounds about right. The boutique opened on December 7th, 1967. Its exterior was admittedly stunning, as well as its design throughout. But as far as the shop went, it really didn't offer anything out of the ordinary, and the Fool failed to produce the amount of clothing they had promised. The boutique never made money, and became rife with shoplifting. All the while, George and John were visiting the Maharishi frequently, as he had a home in London, and remained ever keen on keeping the Beatles in his grasp, which he did. John and George even contemplated financing a film about the Maharishi, the proceeds of which would go straight to his organization. This, thankfully, was nixed. It didn't end there. One day, out of the blue, Peter Brown received a phone call. I received a phone call from the lawyers for ABC television in America. They said that the Maharishi had been negotiating with them for a TV special that he said would include an appearance by the Beatles. ABC's lawyers were calling me to confirm the Beatles' cooperation. I told them that the Beatles had no intention of appearing on the Maharishi show. But only a week later, the lawyers were back on the phone. The Maharishi was insisting he could deliver them. I called the Maharishi in Sweden, where he was lecturing at the moment, and explained the problem to him, but his answers were obscure and indefinite. I decided to fly to Malmo to insist he not represent the Beatles as being part of his projects. In Malmo, the Maharishi greeted me warmly, but only giggled and nodded, and chattered on like a mouse on speed as I laid down the law. The following week in London, I was again contacted by ABC's lawyers, who said the Maharishi was still insisting the Beatles would appear on his TV show and was soliciting sponsors with this understanding. I went to Malmo again, this time with Paul and George in tow. We met with the Maharishi and tried to explain to him that he must not use their names to exploit his business affairs. But the Maharishi just nodded and giggled again. "He's not a modern man," George said forgivingly on the plane home. "He just doesn't understand these things." Paul McCartney's relationship with Jane Asher had been on the rocks quite a bit over the past few years. Their relationship worked, and also didn't work, because of the similarities in their lives. Jane was a successful actress, and while she wasn't nearly as famous as Paul, she was still in the public eye. She spent much of the year traveling for stage plays and films, while Paul did the same for touring. It was a constant point of contention between them. Jane is a fascinating character. Whereas we have heard extensively from just about every romantic partner of the Beatles, in writing or in interviews, Jane has never shown any desire to share this part of her life, to try and capitalize on it in any way. She has remained close to silent. And the same goes for Paul, as the most revealing bits of their relationship come from his music rather than his words. While I cannot speak for Jane, and Paul claims they had a quote, arrangement, it would be near impossible to find a less faithful partner than Paul. This goes for all of the Beatles, and not just Paul, but it probably would not be an exaggeration to say that he quite literally slept with hundreds of women during the course of his and Jane's relationship. Yet, they always returned to each other. They both held high status. They ran in the same circles. They seemed to maintain a reasonably healthy balance of power. In December of 1967, Paul and Jane spent more time together than they ever had before, including weeks at Paul's farmhouse in Scotland. They were honeymooning, in a sense, and perhaps as a result of this close contact. On Christmas Day, Paul would announce to his family that he and Jane were engaged. Would this engagement mark a change in Paul's behavior? Will it reshape his relationship with the band? Time will tell. And as 1967 drew to a close, the Beatles informed their team that they would be leaving for Rishikesh, India, to stay at the Maharishi's ashram. Screw the business, screw the red flags surrounding the Maharishi. It was time to take a trip and meditate. And things would only get worse from here. The Beatles' time in India has attained mythological status, and for very good reason. It was here where they wrote most of the White Album. Here, where for just a brief period, the Beatles found some rest, left their bubble, and escaped the chaos that had surrounded them for years. But did they though? Most of you already know the answer, and those of you who don't will soon find out. Next time on Why the Beatles Broke Up, what happened in India. Thank you all so much for watching. If you would like to continue this story, please consider subscribing. I'll be releasing these videos every 2 weeks. I also have a large number of videos recounting the Beatles' history and the making of their albums, if you want to see more. And if you'd like to watch part 4 of the series right now, you can do so by joining my Patreon for only $1 a month. It's a wonderful way to support the channel, and I would like to take a moment to personally thank all of my Patreon supporters. With that, Thank you so much for watching. Until next time.